Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classics Lectures. This is Harvard Classics Lecture number 56, the Harvard Classics volume number 6, Poems and Songs of Robert Burns. Well, we're going to spend a bit of time now just talking about, sometimes referred to as Robbie Burns, sometimes the Bard of Ayrshire, the Plowman poet he's sometimes referred to as. We've been working now, and the Harvard Classics lectures are posted at learnstrong.net. You can go down that left-hand side and see. With Volume 4, we did Milton. With Volume 5, we did Emerson. And now in Volume 6, we do Burns. There has to, of course, always be questions when you begin by making lists of any kind, when you begin by putting together compilations or anthologies of any kind. Why did this one get in and this one did not get in? It, of course, has to be a question why Dr. Eliot, the president of Harvard at the time, would select the poetry and the songs of Burns to the exclusion, for example, of Wordsworth or Byron Shelley Keats, the other important romantic poets of England, at least. Like, why is it Burns? I think there are a lot of answers to this. In the Harvard Classics, we're going to see a couple of poetry volumes, and of course we'll have poems by all of those poets that I just mentioned. I think that people, though, that we are all attracted to the joy, the exuberance, the satiric wit of Burns, and for that reason I'm going to challenge us to maybe just enjoy the poetry and not have the debate too strongly about why Burns and not other kinds of important writers. Just to remind, our learning theory is always in 303 at play. We are looking to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. We do that in our annotative process of 3 levels. We try to answer 3 questions about any text we study. What does the text say? Level 1, summarizing. Level 2, what does the text mean? Here we subdivided 2A themes, messages, and 2B rhetoric, not what is said, but how it's said. For example, the fact that so much of what Burns writes is in the Scottish Gaelic dialect is going to make it difficult sometimes and not so accessible to readers who are maybe a little bit going to struggle, right, to read it. We'll do our best there. At level 3, we ask, how can I relate to this text? At 3A, how can I relate to other titles that I know and to the world at large? And then finally, and most importantly, how can I relate this information back to myself personally? As we look at several offerings of Burns, and hey guys, I'm not going to be able to do all of the 662 different offerings in this volume. We'll have to do just a few of these texts. We'll begin with a brief biography and then do a close study of a few of these texts, and that will have to be our hour together. He's born the 25th of January in 1759. I mean, just think about that. 1776 is our Declaration of Independence, so it kind of gives you a sense of where you are. He dies the 21st of July, 1796 of a poor heart and bad health, probably at the age of 36, 37. And probably he did end his life early because of some of the work that he did on the farm. Without question, considered the greatest poet of Scotland. He is a prototype of the early Romantic poet, although Burns is a whole lot more than just simply calling him a Romantic poet, no question, right? He is a great, though, inspirer of the Romantic movement, no question. He's also, much to the help of his mother, a great collector of the folk songs. Auld Lang Syne comes to mind. We'll mention it briefly, right? Scots Way, what becomes the unofficial national anthem of Scotland, considered by many. Maybe the greatest Scot of them all. Let's say a couple of things about his biography. He is born into poverty, and his father works very hard to try and give him the best education that he can give to him. He almost all of his life, though, of his young adult life, he was a worker in the fields. I mean, when he's called the poet of the plowman, he actually is this. And he probably did overstrain himself, and he hurt himself doing this kind of work. His romantic liaisons, will not get into a lot of this, but if you want to do your own reading of this, he spends a lot of time with the Bonnet, and he writes a lot about it. probably two of the most popular, Gina Moore and Mary Campbell. He writes lots and lots of songs and poems. The very notion that guy meets girl and then wants to write about the experience of guy meeting girl, enjoying girl, losing girl, or some combination of all of that is going to be central to a whole lot of his poetry. But that's not all, obviously, of his poetry, but it has a lot to do with it, no question. Ironically, Burns published his stuff on his way out of country. He was actually looking to get to the West Indies, and just as kind of a throwaway, he decides to publish, and he immediately becomes kind of really famous and brought to the capital, and kind of, you know, becomes a celebrity and all of those kinds of things. He actually writes his first lines when he's 15, though. The source of so much of his work, well, very clearly, the Bible is clearly, as it would have been for most poets, Shakespeare, huge for him. Alexander Pope is also a significant importance for him as well. I mean, I'll just read you a couple of lines from his epistle to the Reverend John Mammoth on page 110, 111, if you're actually working with the Harvard Classics, volume number 6. He says it this way, to Pope, he says, "O Pope, had I thy satire's darts to give the rascals their deserts, I'd rip their rotten hollow hearts and tell aloud their juggling hocus-pocus arts to cheat the crowd. God knows, I'm no the thing I should be, nor am I even the thing I could be. But 20 times I'd rather would be an atheist clean than under gospel colors hid be just for a screen." Well, I mean, we can see here that you know, the influence of Pope is clear and obvious on him. His wit, his political satiric wit is genius, truly genius. I mean, we're going to see some of this in To a Louse here in a moment. In 1786, he has his first collection, poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect. Here, To a Mouse is included. And it's a huge success, and from this point on, he became the heaven-taught plowman, as he sometimes is referred to. He does die of a weak heart, and it's tragic. It's interesting, and I've said this in other lectures, because I've given a series of lectures on English Romanticism. I mean, you can find those at learnstrong.net as well. It's interesting how Burns fits that category of dying quite young, right? Before he's 40 years old, he's dead. And we often wonder if he had lived to be the age of Wordsworth, what he could have been able to continue to produce. His work is known, if you look at any kind of, you know, academic treatment, it's usually like this. His work is known for its natural, its direct, its spontaneous quality. He loved the ballad tradition of Scotland and the folk tunes that his mother would sing to him. He ultimately ended up publishing many, many of these. The critic, James Douglas, has pointed out, quote, "It's not easy to tell where the vernacular ends and the personal magic begins." End quote. I think there's a lot of truth to that idea that, you know, Burns is such a beautifully eclectic writer, we might say. He takes stuff from all over the place, but a philosophic writer as well. We've said this in other lectures, and I've talked elsewhere about To a Mouse and To a Louse, but I'm going to review those comments again for our Harvard Classics here. But let's just point out for your notes that Burns is this genius way of going from the simple to the complex. I would write that down. I'm actually going to try and prove this here in a second with several offerings. He loves to go from the simple to the complex. Burns, a fierce patriot, a fierce Scotsman, no question. But he's also a man of the world, no question as well. And we will see this, and in many ways, he's postmodern before there was postmodernity. He is going to challenge us to really think about what it means to live in this world and our relationship to nature and the world at large. My modus operandi here is, and I'll do the best I can. I mean, I don't have a lot of time to spend with this, and that's unfortunate, but I'll begin with maybe his most famous poem. Steinbeck, of course, will call Of Mice and Men his novel, his classic novel, from the text To a Mouse. So we'll start there, and then we'll go to a couple of other similar texts, To a Louse and To a Mountain Daisy, and we'll briefly comment on those. Of course, A Red, Red Rose, I mean, you have to include in any comments on Robert Burns because it may be his most famous little poem. And then a Song of Death. What I'm doing is I'm trying to select different kinds of texts from this anthology to just give you a sense of what it is that Burns is most famous for. Auld Lang Syne is the text that, or the song that is usually sung, or poem lines, poetic lines recited at the end of years. We'll make some comment about that. And then we'll finish with Scots Way. That's what actually was called the Robert Bruce's March to Bannockburn. Really, for some Scotsmen, still today is considered the greatest thing that Burns ever wrote. Well, let's turn now to a mouse, and page 125 if you've actually got the Harvard Classics volume. Sometimes it's interesting to find these Harvard Classics volumes. They lie around, for example, in used bookstores. And I certainly challenge you, as I've always said, dude, you got to go to used bookstores and just walk in and enjoy the smell, the scent, and begin to kind of pick up old books. And if you find copies of the old Harvard Classics, and you can find Volume 6, which is the old Burns copy, then you can follow along this way. To a Mouse, on turning her up in her nest with the Plow, November 1785, written at the age of 26, we would say. This is fascinating as well, right? Just a few years older than you guys. Let's say three things about this poem, then we'll listen to it, and then we'll finish, all right? This poem does three things. Burns is out in the field, and he's plowing with one of those old plows, and he turns over a mouse's house. Now that mouse, of course, has been working so hard to build his little mouse's house under the ground, and he destroys the house, and the little mouse goes scurrying off. Burns then sits down, and he writes this poem to the mouse, where he says three things. One, he says to the mouse, "I'm really sorry I jacked your house." Right? Number two, he says, you know, it's fascinating though, the more I think about it, you and me, we're very similar in that humans are a lot like mice. We do all of this work to create all of these plans, to build these houses. Now we're speaking obviously not just literally but metaphorically. And then along comes some unseen, even unexpected plow, crash right through the middle of our house, everything is jacked. All of our plans, the best laid plans of mice and men soon off to go awry is the transliteration of the lines. And then number three says, but you know what, Mouse? It's fascinating. As much as we are alike, in that the plow comes along and we never saw it coming and it jacks us, there is actually a fundamental difference between the two of us. This philosophic understanding about how it is that he and the mouse are philosophically quite different will be at the end of our poem, and this will be for us the reason for studying this poem. My reading of this poem is nowhere near as good as a professional's reading of this poem. So I'm going to share that professional reading of the poem with you. Let's go ahead now and just listen and enjoy the language of To a Mouse, Robert Burns.
To a Mouse by Robert Burns. Wee, sleekit, cowering, timorous beastie, oh, what a panic's in thy breastie. Thou needna start a wassy hasty by bicker and brattle. I would be laith to run and chase thee with murder and prattle. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union, and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. I doubt na whiles but thou mun thieve. What then, poor beastie? Thou mun live. A daemonicker and a thrave's a small request. I'll get a blessing with a lave, and never missed. Thy wee bit housey too in ruin, its silly walls the winds are strewing, and naething now to big a new in no fogage green, and bleak December's winds ensuing, baith snell and keen. Thou saw the fields laid bare and waste, and weary winter coming fast, and cosy here beneath the blast thou thought to dwell, till crash, the cruel cooter passed out through thy cell. That wee bit heap o' leaves and stibble has cost thee mony a weary nibble. Now thou's turned out for all thy trouble, but house or hold, to thole the winter's sleety dribble, and Cranrock called. But Mousey, thou wert know thy lane, and proving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang after gley, and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. Still thou art blessed compared with me. The present only toucheth thee, but och, I backward cast my ee on prospects drear, and forward, though I canna see, I guess and fear.
Now this is an interesting little
To a
poem.
louse.
I'm
on
sorry.
seeing one on a lady's bonnet at church.
This is an interesting little poem because it speaks directly to the challenge of identifying with what's different between being a human and being a mouse. The point that he makes in the poem, as we've already said, one, I'm sorry I jacked your house, right? Two, you know, it's funny, we're kind of similar. We put together our plans and then all of a sudden, bam, there it is. I remember a student who had studied this poem with me. She was one of our top athletes and, great volleyball player, great basketball player. And she came walking through the door on crutches. And I said, whoa, what's up? And she said, the plow got me. And in other words, there it is, right? This notion of right from out of nowhere, all of a sudden something terrible happens, we don't expect it. But it's this third observation at the very end of the poem. Still he says, thou art blessed, compared with me. The present only toucheth thee. But I backward cast me on prospects drear, and forward, though I cannot see, I guess and fear. In other words, it's an interesting observation. He says, hey, I jacked your house. What's the first thing the mouse does? Jumps up, goes, starts building another house. Why? Because he doesn't have a sense or a memory, a fear of the expectation of the next plow to come. In other words, the mouse only lives in the present, right now. As opposed to humans, and what is it he says? Well, I spend most of my time either thinking about the past, all the things that have happened to me. Can we say it out loud? The plows that have jacked us in the past. And, of course, there's the challenge of what's coming. If you know a plow was in the past, then there's a pretty good chance that you have a sense the plow is coming. We have said, it's one of the throwaway mantras in 303, the only difference between you and a fly is you know about fly swatters. Now we can use Burns and say the only difference between you and a mouse is you know about plows. In other words, for a mouse, the capacity to live in the present frees him so that he's not always afraid. Notice that the last word of this poem is fear. Humans live in that condition of constant, perpetual fear. Concerns about what? Well, the penultimate one, of course, because you ain't met no 200-year-old people is, right, ultimately, the largest plow is the one of death. Of course, at 3a, we could make the observation of how Beowulf, that great epic poem, ends. Remember the great Anglo-Saxon poem? It ends with the death of Beowulf, right? We're unaccustomed to that sometimes. Well, I mean, we don't like that as much, right? I mean, we like to watch hero movies where the hero always comes out alive. Beowulf, the epic poem, reminds us what is in fact here. Hey, you know what? We're always kind of worrying about the future because we know what's coming. If we could find some way that would be more present, to live right here, right now, that is to say, to be more like the mouse, we might be more content, more happy. In other words, okay, so something bad happened, now I'm going to keep going. I'm going to rebuild my house again. Why would I do that? I'm just going to get it jacked by another plow. No. You got to keep rebuilding nonetheless. So I want to point out that there's a humanity to this poem, right? I mean, he's saying, I'm sorry to the mouse. There's a philosophic component to this poem as well that says the human condition is often paralyzed by the plow. And the fact that we know that the plow is coming. Think about how in our innocence and in our youth, we don't know so much about plows. We're kind of like that mouse who's kind of under the ground, all nice and warm, and then all of a sudden, wham, there comes the plow. And then we have to deal with the plow. And of course, the plows of our life, at 3B observation, the plows of our life are in many ways what define our biography as being either successful or not successful. Of course, you'll remember that it's Nietzsche, the philosopher, who said, that which does not destroy me makes me stronger. In other words, just because plows have entered your life does not mean that your life is over. The student I was referencing went on. She worked hard and found her college scholarship to be in sports and an athlete still, even though she blew out her knee in her senior year and all of her plans for state championships and the like were gone. She still went on. In other words, she didn't quit. The second poem that we're going to look at is very similar, To a Louse. And if you're following in this volume, it's on page 198. This is also a wonderful little poem. It's published in 1786. It's on seeing a louse, that is to say a single lice, on a lady's bonnet at church. I should point out that this is actually Burns's favorite meter. Let's just make a quick 2B observation, right? Not what Burns says, but how Burns says it. This is really Burns's favorite meter, the standard hobby or the Scottish stanza. It's a 6-line stave, as it's often referred to, probably influenced out of Middle English, where you're going to see these 6 lines. Now, let's play this game really quickly to kind of set it up. Three things we want to say about this poem. One, Burns goes into church, he sits down. Okay? Or the speaker of the poem. We can assume it's Burns. A woman comes in dressed in her finest, and she sits down right in front of him. She's got this big hat, this bonnet thing. She's looking all fine. She thinks of herself as somehow superior to the other people who are clearly poor in the church. And Burns is kind of sitting there. You get the sense that he's trying to, look around her to see what's going on up in front. And all of a sudden he sees that she has a louse, a little lice, on her bonnet. Now normally, you're right. When I say this, normally students are like, ooh, gross. Why? Why do we associate, ooh, gross with lice? Well, of course, we associate lice with poverty. We associate lice with people who don't take care of themselves, who lack pride, personal pride, etc. Well, the irony, obviously, is here's this woman sitting there, and all of a sudden it hits Burns. What should I do? Should I tell her? Should I not tell her? Right? In other words, hey, lady that thinks you're so much better than everybody else, let me tell you that you've got lice on you. Gross, right? Or does he have compassion for the woman and says, you know what, she thinks she's really important and influential. I need to let her live in her own mythology, because if I were to tell her she has lice on her right now, she would be really humiliated. So he's kind of caught in the middle. Finally, number three, and most importantly, just like we said about To a Mouse, in this poem we have the movement from the very simple to the interestingly philosophic and complex. He asks this question: what would it be like to be able to see ourselves the way other people see us? Right? I mean, we know what we look like in a mirror, but what we don't know is how our best friend or our worst enemy looks at us and sees us. Let's listen to this poem. I hope you enjoy the reading of this poem as well. The same reader, To a Louse, all right?
To a Louse on seeing one on a lady's bonnet at church, by Robert Burns. Ha! Where are you going, you crawling furly? Your impudence protects you sairly. I canna say but you strunt